All right, you guys, thanks for checking out the video. Today I want to go super in depth on setting up hunting slider sites. More specifically the Axcel Landslyde, but a lot of these principles will carry over to most of the slider sites on the market. So the Axcel Landslyde, I got it about a couple months ago. I busted it out of the box and put it on the bow and started working with it. And it was probably the most confusing site that I've ever tried to set up. And so I wanted to do a video to explain to you guys how to set this thing up properly and how to maximize not only your efficiency with the site, but also your time that you spend setting it up. But before we get into the method that I like to use while setting up this Axcel Landslyde, I want to go over some of the gear that I'm going to be using this year. I'm going to be shooting the Matthews V3 31 inch set at 75 pounds, and then my arrows are going to be weighing at about 460-ish grains, and that's going to put me at around 300 foot a second. That arrow weight to that poundage weight ratio is going to put me at about 6 grains per pound, and I'll be coming straight out of my bow. My arrow will be producing 90 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. At 80 yards, my bow, at impact, my arrow will still be at 75 pounds of kinetic energy. You only need 65 pounds of kinetic energy to kill a muskox. So at 80 yards, I'm a 75. I know that some people like to run a super heavy arrow, and if that's something that you want to do and it makes you more comfortable with your shot, then by all means go for it. But I just want it to be known that it's not a necessity. You don't need to shoot that heavy of an arrow. It's totally acceptable to shoot a lower grains per pound arrow. Maybe not quite 6 grains per pound. I would say 6.5 grains per pound is a really good place to start out at. But it's acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think that a lot of people that have those heavy grain arrows, maybe they're not as seasoned and they're not as comfortable making a lethal shot, and they don't really want to go over 20 yards. Those are really the only two situations that I could see having a 6, 7, 800 grain arrow. Because if you have that heavy of a grain arrow and you don't intend to shoot over about 30 yards max, then that would be a good setup, you know, because you will get through anything with that. You will be able to probably bust through bone and anything else that you could hit. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not efficient. It's not efficient if you shoot all year round, just moderately. I'm saying, like, you know, 40 to 50 arrows a week, okay? Like, shoot 60, 70 arrows a week, 10 arrows a day minimum. If you're doing that, you should be able to shoot a lighter grained arrow and get by with it, and you'll have a lot flatter trajectory on your bow, and you'll have a lot smaller of a sight tape, you know. So if you're out in the field and you need to make a split second judgment call on what the yardage is between you and something you're aiming at, and you miss that yardage by 3 or 4 yards, you know, as long as you're under maybe 50 yards, probably 40 yards, then you'll be okay with the 460 grain arrow. When you get up into the 800 grain arrows and you make a mistake on the yardage 3 or 4 yards, you're missing that. You're missing the target. There's no question you are going to miss the target. So with that said, I'll get off that tangent, but just wanted it to be known it's okay if you shoot a lighter arrow. If you feel accurate enough to shoot a lighter arrow, your arrow will get there faster, the animal will not have as much time to move, it'll be okay. All right, so the next thing I wanted to touch on for this video is titled Things I Wish I'd Known. So things that I wish that I knew before I ordered this site, so that I could have ordered extra parts or extra pieces or modified the order. So the first thing that I wish I would have known before I ordered this is that on the back side here, there is a bracket, and it's called like a dead stop bracket. And what it does is there's a little piece on the back of this sight right here, and it sticks out. So whenever you adjust your sight, eventually it will hit that bracket and it won't be able to adjust past that point. So what that does is it'll do one of two things, whatever you set it up for. It will you can either put it up where your 20-yard mark is and have it set so that at 20 yards, that bracket is where your top pointer is at 20 yards, that bracket is touching that piece on the back so that you can't just up above that 20-yard mark. So say you're at like 70 yards and you want to quick adjust up to 20 to get all your pins back in the right position. You can just run it up until it stops, lock it down, and all your pins are right back to where they were before you adjusted the sight. Okay, so that's one of the things it can do. The other thing that it can do is it can add a dead stop to the bottom for clearance. So had I known that you could add two, or if I would have looked into it a little bit more, I would have realized that I could have put another one below to add a dead stop underneath so that I could find my clearance position for my arrow coming out of the bow so that it doesn't hit my scope housing. And then I could have put another bracket there so that I don't adjust it past that point and end up shooting my scope on accident. So if you're looking into getting one of these, you might consider getting another dead stop bracket for the back of your sight. It's not a necessity, and one of the things that you can do to avoid that is you can run this sight all the way down until it bottoms out on the bottom of this slider portion of the sight, and then you can start trying to figure out where to mount it to your bow. So with the sight bar actually mounted to the sight bar mounting bracket on the bow, you can start adjusting this sight itself up and down on the slider portion to figure out where you're going to lose clearance. Like if you have your arrow all the way up, or if you drop away, you loosen the cable or pull the bow back on a draw board, you can figure out where that arrow starts losing clearance, but it's not really as reliable as just having a dead stop, and it makes it very hard to add a sight tape to this, because if you do that and you mount this way down here, your 20-yard pin, I'm speaking from experience here, your 20-yard pin is going to be like right around in here, right? Like right in here. And so when you adjust this up to, well, we'll say here-ish, okay, so your marks are going to be right around in this area, and whenever you go to adjust this metal sight tape, you're going to have to put it right around here. But what that does is it makes this bottom screw hole hang over the edge, and you're not going to be able to screw this sight tape in. So you need to be very careful of that. And two, even if you have this sight tape all the way in the bottom hole and everything lines up, there's not a threaded hole on, if this hole is in this bottom threaded hole, there's not a hole for the top screw in that position. It's just a piece of metal right there. So there's no way to screw in the top part of the sight tape. So you need to have this sight tape either on the second to last hole from the bottom to be able to have two screw holes or higher. So be careful of that and mount the sight so that your 20 is somewhere towards the top, which is what the direction says, but I was stubborn and I tried to figure out a better way to do it, and it didn't work out. So just sharing that with you for whenever you go to set this thing up. Number two of things I wish I'd known is that these pointer indicators on this sight don't always have enough travel to meet your sight tape markings if you don't strategically place them before you start sighting in your bow. So this is exactly how they send it from the factory. They're both pinched in as tight as they can get together. And the mistake that I made is that I started sighting in my 20-yard mark, which is okay, and I sighted in my 20-yard mark with this top pointer indicator, and I made a mark on the sight tape, and then I ran my whole sight tape housing or sight down on the slider portion of the sight, and then I used my top pin again, and I made my sight tape marking on this top pointer again for the further distance. So what I did then is I ran my sight back up to where my top pointer was on the 20-yard position, and I went to adjust my bottom pointer to that 60-yard position, but as you can see, it only has about, I'd say maybe a 1/4 inch of adjustability down. So what happened is I bottomed out and I couldn't reach that 60-yard mark. So what I had to do is I had to move this top pointer up and out of its original position, and what that meant is I had to move the sight down to get it back on the 20-yard mark, but then my pin moved. So then I had to re-sight in my whole system from 20 to 60 again with the top pointer indicator a little bit higher so that I could reach the bottom mark. Now, what I wish I would have known is that I could order a second set of these pointers, and that way, if you make a mistake like that, you can always use the second set and use the top pointer on that second set for your bottom pointer. And what that would do is it would turn this L right here around, and it would come down this way, and then you'd have a lot bigger gap. So that's something you could think about. You can order a second set of these. You can also flip-flop these, put the top on the bottom and the bottom on the top, and that'll give you a wider gap. You can do a lot of adjustability with these pointers, but if you don't think about what you're doing before you do it, you're probably going to have to redo some work. So the last thing that I wish I'd known before I ordered this sight is that if you order the 5-pin configuration inside the scope housing, you cannot have a 20 through 50 yard pin gap if you're shooting around 310 foot a second. And the reason for that is because these pins taper off toward the actual fiber optic, and they're wider at the base. So they can only squeeze together so tight at the base. As you can see right now, they're about as tight as they can get at that base. So my 20 would be on, but my 50 yard pin would be around 7 inches high because I couldn't get that pin high enough in that housing to meet 50. That's not a huge deal because you can sight in at 30 yards. If you're shooting 310 foot a second, you can sight in your sight at 30 yards and shoot your top pin at 30 yards at a 20 yard target and hit relatively well. So you don't really need a 20 yard pin anyways. It's just something that I noticed because I'm used to having a slower bow, and whenever I would have a slower bow, I would sight in a 20 through 50 yard gap. And whenever I started trying to do that with this, I couldn't do it. So I just wanted to throw it out there for anybody that's used to shooting a slower bow, that just got a faster bow. If you want to shoot a 20 through 50 yard pin gap, it's not gonna happen. So what you can do is you can actually take the 5-pin configuration, you can order that. If you don't want a 3-pin configuration, you can always take a pin out and have a 4-pin configuration instead of a 5. Those are just some things that I noticed while I was setting this sight up that caused me having a lot of problems and having to redo a lot of steps. So I just wanted to throw them out there for you guys so that you guys could kind of have a leg up before you start working on this sight. Alright, so I have a step-by-step process on setting up this sight, and it will get you from point A to point B in the most efficient way possible. So the first step, super simple, make sure your bow is tuned perfectly. If your bow's out of tune even slightly and you do all of the work to set this sight up, and then you have to go back and change something in your tuning and change something on your bow, well then you just ruined everything that you just did on this sight, and you're gonna have to redo all of these steps. So make sure your bow is perfectly tuned before you start this. Step 2 is going to be figuring out which position to mount this sight on the sight bar. But be careful with that, because like I said earlier, the lower you have this on the sight bar, the lower your 20 yard mark is going to be, and then you will run out of space for your sight tape. So be careful with that. I would suggest running this up to at least probably just below midway, and that'll put your 20 probably right around in here. And then you can figure out where your clearance is from that point, and you should be a whole lot better off. So step 3 is going to be setting your first, second, and third axis on the sight. So you're going to go ahead and bolt down the sight bar to the sight in whatever position that you found had the best clearance and the best adjustability, and then you're going to set your first, second, and third axis. All right, so now that we have our first, second, and third axis set, the next step is going to be setting our pins inside the scope housing. So the way that I like to do this is I will set my pins to as low of a position as you feel comfortable with. Now, this is gonna do two things. One, it's gonna get your top pin very close to this mark on the inside of that scope ring, and that's gonna put your top pin very, very close to the center of this actual scope ring, which in theory should help you out at further distances because it's gonna help you have better peep sight alignment with your scope. And two, it's going to have all of your pins so low that there's not gonna be very much surface area underneath of your pins to hinder your clearance. So if you have all of your pins in the very top position on this site, you can think there would be a lot of surface area hanging out under those pins, but since they're so low, all of the surface area that's extra is above the pins, which is okay. All right, so the next step is going to be choosing the position that you mount your sight in the sight bar mounting bracket. So how far away or how close to the riser you mount your sight. And the reason that this is so early is because a lot of people like to torque tune with their sight, including myself. And when you torque tune with your sight, you're gonna have to run your sight in and out. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna change your pin gap. So the closer to the riser your sight is mounted, the smaller your pin gap is gonna be, and the further away your sight is mounted from the riser, the larger your pin gap is gonna be. So for people that like to torque tune with their sight, you're gonna need to do this step before you start sighting in the bow, because if you decide later on that you wanna have your sight a little bit further away from the riser because it's a little bit more forgiving, you're gonna have to redo your entire system on the sight. All right, so the next thing is gonna be peep alignment. So peep sight height on your string. The thing that I would do is I would set your furthest pin first. And I know in my other video, I set my closest pin first and then I walked back and did my furthest pin. But after I got to thinking about it, I think it's more optimal if you just walk your way back and adjust your sight as you walk so that you can get it kind of closer. You're not making a huge adjustment all at once. And then sight in your bottom pin first. That way you can keep as much clearance as possible in your sight. And then once you get that bottom pin, by adjusting your whole travel adjustment on this sight, once you get that position set, you can set your peep height to that so that you have the most alignment at all distances. That way, whenever you have to break out of your pin range, so say 20 through 50, if you want to go through 60 or 70, whenever you break out of that pin range and start traveling your sight down lower, your peep sight is in a lot better alignment with those further distances than it would be if you first set your 20-yard pin. All right, so in conjunction with that, what you're also going to be doing is finding your furthest sight pin position. So whatever yardage you want that bottom pin to be set at, you're finding that yardage mark on your sight tape. So once you have your bottom pin fine-tuned to whatever yardage you've decided that you want it to be at, you're gonna take a pin and mark right next to that bottom pointer indicator. From there, what you're gonna do is you're gonna raise your sight up to where you think your closest pin, so whatever you want that top pin to be set at, you're gonna try to gauge that gap and you're gonna walk to that closest distance, and then you're gonna shoot using that bottom pin again and that bottom pointer again. You're gonna shoot in that distance with your bottom pointer indicator. All right, so as a word of caution, make sure that at your closest distance that you're not adjusting your face or your anchor point or your peep sight. Because basically you just aligned your peep sight to the 50-yard mark or your furthest distance mark. So what you did is you made them match. Well, Now, to get your closest distance mark, you've had to raise that pin by the travel adjustment on your sight. You've had to raise your whole scope housing up, okay, to get that bottom pin to match up where your 20 yard or whatever your closest yard distance is. So what it's gonna do is at full draw, it's gonna feel like your Peep's low again. You just need to make a clean shot, a controlled shot, and don't try to make the shot look textbook through what you're seeing. So don't let yourself get to where you're pulling your string higher, or you're changing your head angle, or even changing your Peep sight to match that, because if you do, you're gonna give yourself a false read whenever you move that scope housing back to its original position, to its permanent position for your pins inside that housing. So your gap is gonna be different than what it should be if you move any of those three things. You're not gonna get a true read of your sight tape gap. I know that that's maybe not ideal to sight in your top mark, so your top pin, but it's the best way that I've found to do it, and it's better than doing the bottom pin, because once you start making those big adjustments with your Peep at the further distances, the mistakes are amplified. So it's better to do it at the 20-yard mark than it is to do it at the 50-yard mark. And if you guys have a better way of doing this, like always, reach out and let me know. Like, I don't know if there's a better way of doing it or not. I don't think there is, but I would be definitely open to hear anybody's opinions on that, or findings of how they've set up their sight and it's worked out well for them. So once you get that distance fine-tuned, then you're gonna make a mark on the bottom pointer indicator again, and that will give you your sight tape gap. All right, so from there you should have both marks made on your sight tape with the paper over it. So what you're gonna do from there is you're gonna move that bottom pointer back down to that lowest position, so that lowest mark that you made. What you're gonna do is make sure that you lock this sight down very firmly, and then you're going to stay in the same position as you were, so at whatever that closest yardage is, and you're gonna sight in that top pin. So you're not gonna worry about your major traveling adjustment on this slider anymore. You're going to only adjust your top pin into that position. So the way that you're gonna do that is you're going to loosen the bolt that's on the back side of this sight, so they are in order of the pins. So the top pin is the top bolt, the next pin is the next bolt, the next pin is the next bolt, and so on all the way down. You're gonna loosen up the pin that you need to move, and then you're going to adjust that pin with this turn knob underneath. All right, so now that you have your top pin set into the position that you wanted that closest yardage to be, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take that sight tape that you made your markings on, and you're gonna match up the metal sight tape or the laminated paper sight tape with those markings. So you're gonna find which sight tape matches the markings that you made, and then you're going to remove the sight tape that has the paper that you made your markings on and replace it with the metal sight tape or the laminated sight tape. And make sure that you're installing that sight tape as close to those pointer indicators and the yardage marks that you found as possible. So if you had your top pin at 30 and your bottom pin at 60, and your pointer indicators are on 30 and 60 on that sight tape, make sure that you mount the new one as close to 30 and 60 as possible. That way you don't have to do as much work to adjust those pointer indicators into their positions. We have our box formed in our sight. Our 20-yard pin is at 20 yards. Our 20-yard pointer, our top pointer is at 20 yards. Our bottom pointer is at 55 yards, and our bottom pin is at 55 yards. All right, so here is where you're going to set your dead stop on your sight. If you haven't already done that for the bottom for a clearance marker, you're gonna go ahead and set your dead stop at your 20-yard mark, tighten that down, and then now you won't be able to adjust your sight past that point. All right, so now just to verify that everything is correct with that sight tape, what I would do is I would take your top pointer to start with and adjust it to whatever sight position, so whatever yardage mark on that new sight tape that you want, and then take a rangefinder out and get to that distance, and then shoot with that top pin at that distance just to verify that the sight tape is correct. And then if you want, you can do the same thing with the bottom pointer and the bottom pin. So from there, the last thing that you should need to do is sight in your middle pin. So just go to whatever yardages you want those pins to be set at, and then sight in each individual pin at those yardages. And then your sight should be perfectly set up, and you should be able to use it in whatever application you choose to use it in. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you don't mind, please do like, share, subscribe, comment, do all that fun stuff, and save the video to your watch later list if you're interested in coming back to this video for further reference in the future. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video.